Hi, Misha here, and somewhat because I've had some new models, and somewhat because I just feel like talking about it, kind of going over different Soviet-Russian aircraft. And now it's time to talk about the MiG-15 in detail. And I have some 1/72 scale models here. Go over the history, mostly talking about the variants. To go into the full service, especially Korean War, well, that'd be too long of a video even for me. But anyway, as usual, do my best to get things on camera. You know my situation, so if nothing else, turn the screen off if I'm not pointing at anything, and we can just talk about history, because that's kind of what I'm in it for right now. Anywho, the MiG-15, specifically the MiG-15 bis, which was the preeminently produced version. They didn't make all that many of the original. NATO reporting name, FAGOT, as in a bundle of wood sticks. We have three examples here. On the left, we have a Czech 15 bis, circa 1953. Pretty standard fighter interceptor version. In the middle, we have quite an interesting variant. This is the 15 bis R, the reconnaissance or tactical reconnaissance version. And on the right, we have a 15 bis from the East German Air Force, circa 1959, so a later flight. And the East Germans, they tended to benefit from pretty good Soviet tech. They didn't get down-rated stuff quite a bit. Now, these three are all die-cast from Hobbymaster. But over here, we have one more on the landing gear. This is a MiG-15 UTI. Yeah, urinary tract infection, UTI. This is the two-seat trainer version, which is actually very important and would serve even longer than the standard fighter. That's because there never was a two-seat version of the later MiG-17 or even MiG-19. There wouldn't be another two-seater in this series until the MiG-21. As a result, this was used through the 70s and even into the 80s in some places. Heck, even some places use it today, at least in some minor roles. This is actually a plastic model because Hobbymaster doesn't do a two-seat from easy models. And as if FAGOT wasn't controversial enough of a NATO reporting name, this one's called the Midget. Hey, that's the NATO name. What can I do? Anyway, with that, we'll just talk about the history and focus on the variants. This aircraft has a lot of places in history. It's the most mass-produced jet fighter. No one really knows exactly how many were made. Over 13,000 in the USSR and over 4,000 licensed out of the USSR. For example, Czechoslovakia and Poland manufactured these, and China manufactured the two-seat version only as the JJ2. And of course, it's extremely famous for its use in the Korean War and a few episodes afterwards, including the Taiwan Straits in the late 50s, although it was never used in combat during Vietnam. So, let's go back to 1945 and the end of World War II. Now, MiG is a name synonymous with Soviet-Russian fighters. But ironically, it's one of the newer design bureaus. It actually is a kind of an offshoot of the Polyakov Bureau of I-16 fame. And in World War II, early on, it designed and then was produced under its plans the MiG-1 briefly and then the MiG-3. But MiG-3 production would cease in 1942. Not that many were made. What I'm getting at is MiG was not terribly successful in World War II. So here's a MiG-3, as someone pointed out, and when I did a historical video, I accidentally grabbed the Italian MC-205 Sorry about that. Welcome to being blind. That's just kind of how life goes for me. Sometimes I grab the wrong thing. Back in college once, I was trying to do laundry, and instead of putting the soap in the wash, I grabbed a thing of bleach. That's when the no bleach bottle in the washroom rule was established. Sometimes I'll grab a can of something to drink and thinking it's a, say, Dr. Pepper, and then it turns out to be a Budweiser. That is also a fun surprise. Yeah, my life is many things, but boring it's not usually. So I just thought that I'd bring the MiG-3 out so you can see it here while we talk. Now, in 1945, Russia realized that it was really lagging behind jet tech. It was kind of the new thing at the end of the war. Of course, the Germans had the Messerschmitt and the Heinkel 162. The British had the Meteor, and the U.S. had the P-80. They decided in February that we have to have a jet engine. We want a new jet aircraft. And, of course, Russia would get a lot of technology from Germany during and at the end of the war and afterwards. They would reverse engineer German engines as the RD-10 and RD-20. And in 1946, the first pure jet-powered Russian aircraft would fly. They did have some kind of weird piston jet hybrids before, but what was known as the I-300 from the MiG Design Bureau would take to the skies in 1946. It was designed as a bomber interceptor to counter the B-29 threat. Russia, rightfully so, frankly, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were worried about B-29s. So they wanted a kind of a point defense fighter for the PVO, and potentially VVS is more of a tactical fighter, to counter this threat. So the I-300 would fly as a prototype. They would build 3. It had 2 engines. It was different, but kind of a take on the Me-262. But it had a lot of issues. I only had a max speed of about 560 miles per hour, an altitude of not much higher than 42,000 feet. It was originally planned to be armed with 2 23mm cannon and 1 57mm cannon, but this is very quickly reduced to a 37mm cannon. Still quite large, 1.5 inches. But the I-300 would be designated the next year as the MiG-9, which would be the first MiG jet. And it was put into production. They would build a little over 600, including the prototypes. So it was put into VVS service in 1947. And they were working on an improved version known as the MiG-9M, but it was a dead end. The problem was German jet technology. Well, the concept was very good. In fact, they were on the right track. Unfortunately, technology, metallurgy, and what have you of the day was just not up to snuff. In 1946, even though Stalin thought it was a crazy idea, why not try? Russia decided to try to buy the Rolls-Royce engine plans from the UK. They didn't think it would work. They went over, they tried to buy some engines and the plans to make them, and because of a new labor government that was trying to be more cooperative with the Soviet Union, Rolls-Royce sold plans for 2 engines, including the Nene, to Russia. They were supposed to, they bought some just straight-out engines, but they were supposed to manufacture it in Russia and pay a royalty, paying a licensing. The British government were thinking, well, the Russians don't have the metallurgy, they don't have the technology. We can sell them the license, make some money, make some good PR, but they won't really be able to mass produce the engines. Now, there was a stipulation that they would not use the engines in a warplane, but I think everyone knew that was pie in the sky dreaming. At the same time, while this was going on, MiG was ordered to design a new fighter for the new British engine. Now, the British engines were less advanced in concept, but a more mature, more stable design, and they were easier to produce. Keep in mind, the Meteor, it, was as old as the ME-262, all intents and purposes. So MiG was working on the airframe, and they eventually reverse engineered the Neen engine into the RD-45. And you know where this goes. Now, MiG had an interesting concept too. Germany had been researching swept wing design. And so they incorporated this with the RD-45 engine and came up with the first I-310 prototype in late 1947. Now, this was actually fitted with a true Rolls-Royce built engine, and so it was very quickly test flown in December of 1947. I just said that wrong. I apologize. December 30, 1947. You know what I meant. It's a Saturday. You're not paying me enough to do retakes on these. You're not paying me anything, come to think. Why the hell am I doing these? Anyway. So it would fly, and quite successfully early on. And so the MiG-9 was shit-canned, essentially, the MiG-9M, the next version. And in 1948, the I-310 was redesignated the MiG-15 and ordered into full production. And now we come to tonight's featured program, or rather, aircraft. It's kind of ironic that the MiG-15 first flew just 2 months after the prototype F-86 Sabre. However, the Sabre was essentially a straight wing design. It's actually the MiG-15 that required them to kind of go back last minute and rework the Sabre, and that's why it really turned out to be such a great aircraft. But this became the first production swept wing jet, at least full production, and was a very advanced design. In 1948, they would have more prototypes, more test flying, and they would perfect the RD-45 engine. Actually, they would end up producing a slightly improved version as the RD-45F. And this would enter into VVS service in 1949 and would be shown to the West during the May Day parade that year. And so they would start equipping their VVS, and it would be used as really more of a tactical fighter. It was originally designed as a bomber interceptor, like I said. And much like the MiG-9, the MiG-15 had one 37mm cannon over here, pretty hard hitting, but only 40 rounds, 40 shells, and it had two 23mm cannons over here with 80 rounds each. So we're only 200 rounds ammo total. This can be a problem, but they are hard hitting, I'll give them that. We have about a 35-degree swept wing with about a 55-degree tail. We have these brakes in the back, air brakes, and we have additional flaps under the wings. This is an all-metal, mostly aircraft aluminum alloy. It has a sliding canopy. In fact, it does actually work on the model. You can slide it back for your little pilot guy. It does have an ejection seat. That was something kind of tested out in Russia on the MiG-9M, although like I said, that never went into real production. And yeah, the guns were its primary armament. It could carry a fuel tank under each wing, or an unguided rocket or bomb, either 100 kilogram or 200. Originally, it used either 250 or 300 liter tanks under the wings. These were slipper tank types. But in 1949, in July, they tested a new engine. It was first the RD-45FN. This would evolve into the improved KV-1. And so in 1950, the original MiG-15 would be replaced in production by the MiG-15 bis. Now, the NATO reporting name for the BIS would be FAGOT B. That meant the earlier version was retroactively designated FAGOT A. And they would build fewer than 1,350, including prototypes. So not many of the A's were ever really built. The B was just superior in performance, the better engine. They also were able to increase the internal fuel by, about 50 gallons. They gave it a new radio. They gave it a few new navigation aids. They went to some hydraulic control surfaces. Before, especially the prototypes, a lot of it was just manual. And it was just all around an improved craft. They also introduced a new fuel tank for the wings that was 400 liter. Later still, they would introduce an expanded 600 liter. Because, range for jets is important. This is because, again, originally designed as an interceptor. In reality, it was being deployed more as a tactical fighter. It's a relatively small aircraft, and it kind of amuses me. It's 33 feet by 33 feet. It's as wide as it is long. It has a maximum speed of just under 690 miles per hour. And it has a cruise speed of just under 530. So in all ways, it was an improvement on the MiG-9, including the ceiling. It had a max ceiling of at least 50,000 feet. And it actually performed very well at high altitudes, at least for that day and time. But in a dive, these brakes in the back became very important here. It was really never meant to exceed Mach 0.92 any faster in a dive, and it could potentially lose control and have issues. So it was very important to use those. In fact, when they did the BIS, they enlarged and improved the flaps and brakes, and slightly expanded its ability to carry stores under the wings. Eventually, they would also go to newer versions of the cannon. They would still be the same size and ammunition capacity, just, improved models. It was really an impressive aircraft for its day and time. In 1950, the Chinese would have some of these, and also at the end of 1950, they would appear in the Korean War. And for the first little while, they would dominate the skies. They did very well against the F-80, F-84, and the B-29, the aircraft they were originally designed to go against. And they would get exported to many friendly Warsaw Pact nations and elsewhere, at least 20, some sources say 30. But they were widespread. Again, with the production numbers as high as they were, they didn't really have a problem with it. They could build the crap out of these. So going back to 1946 and the whole Rolls-Royce thing, pretty much everyone was wrong. Stalin was wrong. He didn't think the British were stupid enough to sell Russia the design. They were. The British were wrong. Russia certainly used the engine in military aircraft. And Rolls-Royce was naive because not only did Russia produce these, they never actually paid the licensing fee. So they stiffed Rolls-Royce on the bill. About the only people that were right were the designers at the MiG Bureau, and they were really right. So with that, let's talk about some of the variants. The first production MiG-15 flew really at the last of 1948, and by that I mean like the last day. And like I said, the BIS would replace it in 1950. Even though the production was only a few years, there were so many built, there were several versions. Here we have the MiG-15 BIS R, the reconnaissance version. And this is from Czechoslovakian Air Force. Basically, it's a BIS, but instead of having two 23mm cannon on the right here, one of them is replaced with a vertical down-looking camera. Also for range, these would either have the new 400-liter tanks or even an extended 600-liter tank under each wing. And yeah, the original MiG-15 was produced in Poland as the LIM-1, LIM-1, and a reconnaissance version was the LIM-1A. In Czechoslovakia, the first version was known as the S-102. When the Biz came along, in Poland that would be the LIM-2 and LIM-2R respectively. And in Czechoslovakia it would be the S-103. Now China was kind of gearing up to produce the 15 Biz as the J2, but this never really got underway. China did fly as the J2, but never built them. Moving on, there was a test or two to try to fit a radar known as the MiG-15P, but these were not terribly successful. They had to remove two of the cannon on the right, so they only had one 37mm cannon. The radar was very ineffective and early and bulky, and there wasn't room, so it never really went anywhere. There was also the MiG-15 Biz S, which was an escort fighter version. It was basically the same as the standard Biz, except it was fitted with the 600-liter tanks under each wing for extended range. And then there would be the my mind just blanked. Oh yeah, sorry, mind blanked for a second there. There would be the MiG-15 Biz SB, which was a fighter bomber version. It was kind of an ad hoc thing. It could have 2 or even 4 hard points under the wings, and it could carry either 2 or 4 100-kilogram bombs or 2 250-kilogram bombs, or it could carry up to 16 rockets in little clusters. But these were all unguided. There was no radar, and they used the gun's sight. Not very effective. And of course, with the wings being taken up with ordnance, they had to rely on their internal fuel. They did give them a kind of camo paint scheme, whereas before, most MiG-15s were just kind of in a natural, polished silver gray. But they didn't have any real defenses or countermeasures, things like that. But in here on this one, you can see the back air brakes closed. Hobbymaster, you can do them either way. You can also lower the flaps under the wings, unless you have a tank on, like on this one, and there's not room. Yeah, this one does have the larger tankage here on the wings. Kind of neat. And of course, like most Hobbymaster, you can do gear up or down. And throughout production, I'm just going to set this down for a second. Throughout production, they would update avionics, the radio, some other things. You know, it didn't just stay stagnant. But the most important variant is over here. The urinary tract infection, the MiG-15 UTI. The Russian government ordered MiG to develop a 2-seat advanced trainer in April of 1949, and it first flew in 1950. Pretty quick turnaround because they used the same fuselage. They just put a second canopy and cockpit in the back here for the instructor. To make room for it, they removed some fuel tanks. He had pretty crap visibility, but it is what it is. In fact, the MiG-15 didn't have great visibility in the first place. They also removed the guns. Originally, they were going to do one cannon and one machine gun, but quickly the cannon was dropped. So this just had a 12.7 millimeter machine gun, 50 caliber, and that was mostly for training targeting purposes. And as you see here, it does have the large fuel tanks under the wings, the 600 liter. Typically, the UTI would carry these because it had limited internal fuel, and of course with training you want as much of a margin of error as possible. And these were really well liked. They were known as the babushka. They were known to be very durable, dependable, reliable. Pilots just really liked flying them, and that's why they stayed in the service for so long. Now this version, as I said at the beginning, was produced in China, is the JJ2. And Vietnam would have MiG-15s, single and double seat, but they used them all for just training and reserve. They never used them in combat as far as we know. And these were produced in a few nations as two-seaters as well, including like Poland. And they were very popular. They were used to train pilots for the MiG-17, MiG-19, and even MiG-21. They were easy to keep running, and so they served for decades upon decades. And we have to give credit. On March 27, 1968, Yuri Gagarin was killed when his MiG-15 UTI crashed. It wasn't the plane's fault. It was poor weather conditions and miscommunication and poor communication from the ground. Essentially, it flew into the surface of the Earth, which is darkly ironic because the Soviet Union, after Gagarin's first historic flight, would never let him go into space again. They were too worried about losing him as a national treasure. He was such a good propaganda tool. And in the end, he never got to go to space again, and he died that way at the age of 35. But it wasn't the aircraft's fault. It was the Soviet Union's fault, frankly. But those are the variants. Again, not a ton, but worth pointing out. Even in these videos, I'm not really going to get into the service history too much. We can do that in other videos. Let's just talk a little bit about it. Here's that DDR Air Force version. I've got it kind of in a clean configuration, no tanks. The East German Air Force was actually very important to the security of the Soviet Union. They did let the Germans have their most advanced tech, or nearly so, but on the other hand, they kept tight control, more so than with other Warsaw Pact nations, so it was definitely a double-edged sword. And East Germany primarily flew the F-15 from about 1956 through the mid-60s. Really, one of the earliest users would be China, and of course Korea. These would appear in the skies over Korea in November of 1950, and really they would completely own the F-80 and earlier piston aircraft. And they were certainly a handful for the F-84, and pretty much a superior aircraft. It wasn't until the F-86 came along that December, and it had to be rushed into theater and really rushed into service, that the MiG-15 had a true adversary. Now keep in mind, early on, these were being flown by Russians. So they were well-trained pilots, very dedicated. Some of them were World War II veterans, but again, so were a lot of the U.S. pilots. In 1951, Chinese pilots would start to really appear, and then in 1952, North Korean pilots would appear. And these pilots, not to say anything about their intelligence or capabilities, were simply green, not as experienced, and received very brief training. Meanwhile, the U.S. pilots, because the U.S. cycled its aces back home to teach tactics at schools, the newer U.S. pilots were just better. So early on, they were very evenly matched, but in 1952-53, the Sabre was winning, but it had a lot to do with the skills of the pilots involved. At least 650 MiGs were lost in Korea, and I'll probably do a video pinning the two head-to-head, because that was really the big time for the MiG-15. Because of the advancement in technology, radars, better engines, its day was pretty brief. It should be mentioned that Egypt would purchase some from Czechoslovakia in 1955, and they would use these as fighters and fighter bombers in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. And in 1958, during the Taiwan Straits incident, an F-86 would fire an AIM-9B Sidewinder and make the first air-to-air kill with a guided missile in history, shooting down a MiG-15. However, this would also be the incident because another missile failed to detonate and lodged in the tailpipe that Russia got to study an AIM-9 Sidewinder, and that would lead them to develop the Atoll missile, the AA-2 series, and kind of gave them a leg up on missile tech because they'd been kind of lagging behind. So, it played an important piece there. Otherwise, these are just mostly flown in air forces in Eastern Europe until being replaced most places by the MiG-17, which is basically an improved MiG-15. Very similar aircraft. And then, of course, the MiG-19 was the first supersonic. And we get into the MiG-21 after that. So, its day came and went. But for its time, it really did have a lot going for it. And was a superb aircraft early on in the Korean conflict. The aircraft had a lot going for it. It was relatively cheap and easy for Russia to mass produce, much to the British's chagrin. It had very good climb, very good high altitude performance. It was maneuverable, especially at the lower speeds. And, it had a good punch with those cannon, but it was not without its shortcomings. Obviously, it didn't have a radar. It had very primitive technology, and didn't have an all-moving tail, which led to some issues. And as it approached Mach 0.9 and exceeded it, it had a lot of control issues, hence the brakes in the back and under the wings being important. Had an ejection seat, which is pretty good, but it was, of course, not a 0-0. Those really didn't exist then. The cannon were a double-edged sword because of only the limited capacity. If you could hit a target, it basically required marksmen. Whereas with the 50 cals that the Sabre used early on, you could do a lot more spray and pray. And it got a little quirky in maneuverability. As you got into higher speeds, the controls, since they weren't really powered, at least not completely, they got harder to do. They got sluggish. And in dives, it could go out of control. Basically, the best thing for it had good climb and acceleration, but the Sabre could kind of top it in maneuverability and at lower altitudes. And of course, I'm generalizing. There's several types of this and several types of Sabre, so each one. But that's why they were evenly matched, but in different ways. The the MiG-15 was never fitted with missiles. But the Sabre was, although they were the early aims, of course. But the first successful Soviet jet, if you don't count the MiG-9, and the jet that really made the MiG a household name, a name that they would continue for decades, even, I bet, a century will prove true. So yeah, I don't know, just kind of felt like talking about these. We can do a video on the Sabre versus the 15 later on. But yeah, Hobbymaster does a very good job with their die cast here. It's almost entirely metal, including the wings. They usually come with optional different fuel tanks, gear up or down, canopy open. You can remove the pilot. You can open or close the flaps and brakes. So quite a few little options there. The only thing I think they missed a trick. The reason my R is kind of special to me, I think it's about the only one they ever did, a reconnaissance version. I wish they had done the SB, the fighter bomber version, with the camo paint and the 4 hard points with rockets or bombs under the wings. I think that would have been a neat variation that wouldn't have cost them a lot in extra tooling. But they pretty much just stick with the biz. They didn't do the original MiG-15, the FAGOT A. I don't blame them because the differences are mostly internal and negligible. But would have been neat to see even though they didn't make many of them at all, one of the MiG-15Ps would have been cool, but probably not worth the cost of tooling to redesign it for that. But anyway, that I would show you. Funny that three out of 4 of these are actually Czech Air Force. Just kind of how it worked out. So let me know what you think of the MiG-15. I think of it as kind of the flying cigar. I love the look of this thing. It's so steampunk. It's so early generation jet. I love the wing fences too. They're just neat. Pt.1 tube. Open flaps. Alrighty guys, well, it's a weekend when I'm recording this, so I'm going to cut out of here and get to my weekend, but I appreciate you tuning in, and sorry again about the MiG-3 mix-up in the older video. It happens though. Not the first time, won't be the last, I promise. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.